Welcome to Inside Water, the audio partner to the visual world of the water and wastewater industry. From what's happening underground with pipes and pumps to the digital transformation reshaping utilities, this is where the industry's biggest challenges, innovations, and ideas come together. My name's Chris Edwards, and I'll be guiding you through all the twists and turns of the water industry in Australia and beyond. Today, I'll be joined by Professor Stuart Khan. Professor Khan is the head of the School of Civil Engineering at the University of Sydney. His expertise is in water engineering, having published over 200 articles on research relating to water quality and treatment, including drinking water, wastewater, water recycling, and recreational water use. Professor Khan, thanks for being here today.
Thanks for inviting me, Chris.
Not a problem. Your career has spanned pharmaceuticals in wastewater, potable reuse, desalination, PFAS, stormwater, biosolids, and public health. When you look back across that body of work, what has changed most in how the water industry thinks about risk?
So there are many aspects to how the water industry thinks about risk, and there will be a lot to cover there. But I guess one that really stands out to me is how we think about organic chemicals, how we think about trace chemicals in water. So going back 25 years ago, when I was new to doing research in this area, in fact, Sydney had just come out of our cryptosporidium incident. That was happening while I was a PhD student in 1998. And we were very focused, rightfully, and we still are, on microbial contaminants. And so thinking about viruses, bacteria, protozoa, and the things that make people sick and kill people in water. So I'm not suggesting that that's a less significant risk, but we really didn't think very much about chemical contaminants, things like you mentioned pharmaceuticals, hormones, endocrine disrupting chemicals. That was quite new. In terms of the level of detail that was being applied to it. A lot of that was technology driven. So the availability of gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, and liquid chromatography, those things developed really into affordable lab scale solutions in the early 2000s. And that really revolutionized our ability to be able to pay close attention to those contaminants. And so therefore they end up in guidelines and regulation as well, because we can.
You've spent a lot of time working at that boundary between technical evidence and public trust. Why is it that water can seem to become so politically and emotionally charged, even when the measured health risk is relatively low?
And I find myself asking the same question. I ask that question of social scientists. I've had many opportunities to do that. I've worked with many great social scientists over the years. What I learn from them are things like so water is essential. If you think about risks associated with drinking water compared to smoking, for example, and I've had people, I can think of some key individuals who have been very opposed to some water recycling proposals because they're concerned about trace chemical contaminants, and I'm sitting opposite them and they're reeking of cigarettes. They're very different, right? At least in terms of perception. The perception is that you can't avoid drinking water. Water is fundamental to everything that we do, but you can make a choice about whether or not you want to smoke. And that difference actually has a bearing on how we assess the risk, not just how much we accept the risk, but how we assess the risk as being high or low. So water comes into our houses. We expect it to be pure. You look at all of the advertising around bottled water and drinking water, and it is all about purity and health. So we have very high standards for it. Water also has the challenge that because it's so clean, it's easier to measure trace concentrations of contaminants in it than other substances that we might come into contact with, such as food. So it's quite difficult to measure the sort of nanogram per litre concentrations of the same contaminants in a more complex matrix. Beer, wine, any kind of food, can of baked beans. So we have a bit more visibility as well, and we have the reporting. There's a lot more reporting on what's in water as well. So we have that visibility of very low levels of contaminants, and we're not most of the community are not well versed in understanding what nanograms per liter means. It's a bit of an abstract measure. So it's a presence or absence question, and if things are present, which they inevitably are when you measure at low enough concentrations, this triggers concern.
Along with that, PFAS has become one of the defining water quality issues over the last 2 years, even though it's been around for much longer. What do you think the public conversation is getting right about forever chemicals, and where is it still missing the mark?
I think the bit we're getting right, obviously, forever is a bit of an exaggeration, but the point remains that these are chemicals which have a very long lifespan in the environment. They're not easily biodegraded by natural biodegradation processes. And this is a disaster, right? We're looking at all of these cases around the world in water supplies that we haven't paid enough attention to in the past, or we haven't necessarily had the capability to pay attention to them. As we were talking about, the monitoring techniques have evolved over the last few decades, and finding out that many of them have been contaminated for a very long period of time. So that's very hard to manage when you're talking about legacy contamination. You can't just turn off the tap and the problem goes away. The contamination's already out there, and there are sites everywhere around the world now that are dealing with that problem. So I think that yeah, the thing that we're getting right is that people are outraged by that. We have caused a degree of pollution that we can no longer control, and we don't have effective cleanup and remediation solutions for. I think the part where maybe the conversation misses the mark is around guidelines and regulations. When we talk about Australian drinking water guidelines, and people compare it to guidelines and regulations elsewhere, particularly the US EPA in this case, I think the point that there are many aspects of how those numbers are determined. And a key thing is that they are highly conservative, right? You're talking about a calculation to come up with a guideline value that has many parameters that go into it. And at every single one of those parameters, we err on the side of conservativeness. And where you have a high degree of uncertainty, then that conservativeness can be very large because we're acknowledging that we don't necessarily know. So you have this compounding conservancy in guideline calculation, and what that ultimately means is that this is the number that we're very confident there'll be no appreciable health impacts associated with if we're exposed to that number over a lifetime. But it doesn't necessarily mean that higher concentrations are necessarily unsafe, and in fact. There are several orders of safety factors and uncertainty factors that ensure that we're working at numbers well below those that are actually expected to cause public health impacts. And then, of course, there's the question of acute and chronic exposure. So for many chemicals, we're concerned that the guidelines are based on assumptions of continuous lifetime exposure. So just a water sample increasing above the guideline value temporarily for a short period of time for most chemicals where they are based on chronic exposure, it doesn't actually imply any significantly elevated health risk either. So there's a lot sort of built into those guidelines that are complex, and I don't necessarily expect people to understand the detail, but it is a source of frustration sometimes in terms of why those who are well versed in the science and the process see things differently to those who have had less exposure to it.
In recent commentary, you've warned that the cleanup costs of PFAS can ultimately flow through to our water bills, particularly for smaller and regional communities. From your perspective, what would a fair polluter pays model look like in practice?
Yeah, so there are, I think, several aspects along the chain of production and use where that a polluter pays type model could and should be implemented. So right up front, preventing pollution in the first place, we really should have the rigorous environmental impact assessments for chemicals and their approved and non-approved uses that may occur. They're the sorts of things that industry tend to call red tape or green tape because they add to costs for producing and introducing many of these chemicals. But I'd argue that that's necessary red tape if we want to avoid some of the outcomes that we are seeing. Uh, then there's the more direct opportunity for when there are polluted sites. Some sites can be remediated, and some sites are remediated. And so there are treatment plants that can be built. There are various ways that we can invest in improving those sites and reducing the future impacts of them. Those things cost money. The bill could be sent to specific companies or industries. There are ways of distributing costs that are identified as having been responsible for causing that pollution. I think there are even creative ways that we could think about in terms of, in most cases, as you suggested, the responsibility to deal with it tends to come down to the water utility, the next user of that water, and it's the customers then that the costs flow onto. Um, we could, I mean, I'm sort of making this up as we go along, but we could think of ways to effectively charge back some of the costs of additional treatment that is identified as having been required because of particular pollution, and charging that back to polluters. And the way that you might do that might be to create a fund through which, when organisations have been seen to cause pollution, they might be fined, they might have a cost imposed on them, and then proportional to the amount of pollution that they've caused, they might have to pay into this particular fund, and then that could be a fund that water utilities could draw on for additional costs, just like an additional customer that they may have. So that's something that doesn't exist even in concept, but it potentially could. That's a way that we could implement a very retrospective polluter pays.
Excellent. So let's take a bit of a sideways step. Australia has long debated potable reuse, and you've discussed it at length. But as you would know, that urgency changes when dams are full one decade and climate reliability weakens them the next. What's holding back cities like Sydney and Melbourne from treating recycled water as a mainstream drinking water source?
Yeah, so Australians have short memories when it comes to drought. We tend to be surprised every time when we're running out of water, and we panic every time we're in a crisis, and we start thinking about needing to build the next augmentation when we're in a crisis. And it's very difficult for us, apparently, to do that longer term planning while the dams are full. And I've seen that fairly up close. I've seen the New South Wales government, parts of the New South Wales government, including the water minister, pushing to invest in more water security, upgrading, expanding Sydney's desalination plant, for example, and not being successful in getting that through other parts of the government treasury because of competing priorities. When it's not a crisis, when the dams are full, there are other things that we could spend that $1 billion on, and we need those other things too, schools and hospitals and roads and all the things that state governments are responsible for. And unfortunately, that's how it works, and things get put on the back burner until the crisis leaves us without a choice. But to more directly answer your question, what's holding back cities like Sydney and Melbourne? I look at Sydney, we are on that journey, right? So in Sydney, we have the Greater Sydney Water Strategy, which is our official government plan for where our future water supplies are coming from and where we're building resilience for Sydney. And it's quite explicit about purified recycled water. I think there's 140 gigalitres that need to come from rainfall-independent supplies, which will come from a mixture of expanded seawater desalination and purified recycled water. And one of the things that the Greater Sydney Water Strategy required Sydney Water to do was to develop a demonstration plant to start the conversation with the community and regulators and others around what does purified recycled water look like? How do we produce it? How do we use it? Why do we need it? That plant exists now out at Quakers Hill, and Sydney Water are running visits from school students and universities. I take my students out there to learn about why this is a part of Sydney's future. And we will see when the time comes that when we do need it, that we will build more rainfall independent supply, and it will include desalination and it will include purified recycled water. So rather than something actually stopping it, I would say that it's just on a very slow train. It should be accelerated because what we do find is that if you wait for the crisis, it's very hard to build your way out of a crisis. These things take several years from planning and construction and to commissioning through to implementation, that you really do need to start several years ahead of the need. So, but we haven't actually decided we're not doing that. We've decided that we are. It's just too slow a process.
Absolutely. So you've published on both advanced treatment technologies and risk management frameworks. Where do you think the next big gains will come from? Will it be better treatment, better monitoring, better governance, better communication, or some combination of all of them?
Yeah, all of the above. So certainly better treatment. We can treat. There's a saying in the water sector that you can treat water to any quality you like by filtering it through money. And that's the case. Water treatment is expensive. So we're not searching the ability to be able to produce higher quality water, because we can already do that to any standard, but to be able to do that at lower cost and at lower carbon footprint are the big needs, I think, and that's what will make it implementable. So costs are a significant barrier in many cases. So new technologies that reduce the capex and the opex of water treatment are very important. Improving monitoring is very important. Monitoring is a very important part of our risk management. A lot of our monitoring still is very retrospective. We take a sample, we send it to the lab, we get the results 3 or 4 days later, and we find out what we sent to customers last week. We need to be able to do monitoring that is more real time, and gives us more opportunities to really understand how our treatment processes are performing, our treatment and our management processes for catchment management and things like that, and to be able to identify fluctuations and deviations that may mean reduced water quality going to customers. And we need to be able to do that quickly, and that will build first of all, capability to manage risk, but I think it will also build confidence for regulators and for the community to know that we do have that very high level of very rapid response control for different types of supplies. What were the others? You mentioned the technology, the monitoring.
Governance or communication.
Look, we do have gaps in governance. PFAS is a good example, and sort of people sort of looking around and pointing the finger and asking whose fault is this? Who's taking responsibility in cases in Sydney where, when we've discovered that PFAS chemicals are being measured in water supplies where they've probably been for a long time, almost certainly been for a long time, the Blue Mountains scenario. Why didn't we pick that up? And it's not simply because we didn't have the monitoring capability over the last 20 years. And it's not because it wasn't in the Australian Drinking Water Guidelines. PFAS has been in the Australian Drinking Water Guidelines since about 2018. Why wasn't the governance there to make sure that we went out, we had a look, we did the risk assessment, we got a handle on what was going on sooner, rather than waiting. actually for an academic to go out and take some samples and report that back to the media. So I think we do have things that we need to sort out in that space.
I want to dive in on your point about water quality because you have recently looked at recreational water quality and urban estuaries. As our cities get denser and the stormwater systems face increasing pressure, how do you think we should be rethinking the relationship between urban design, wastewater infrastructure, and public health?
We need to understand the close ties between all of those things. So very often we think of water quality as something that happens in the river. But what happens in the river is almost entirely governed by what's happening on land. It's to do with how we build our cities, which influences both the quality of the stormwater runoff that we produce, but also the patterns of runoff, and those patterns have a big impact on water quality in the river as well, whether you come in a short continuous trickle or a big flush every time it rains because you've landed on all these impervious surfaces and washed off all of the contaminants. So in Australia, for a long time, for decades now, we've used the term water sensitive urban design and water sensitive urban design that has many aspects, but a key aspect is making sure that we design cities that capture water where it lands, uses that water where we can. We try to reduce the big peaks in runoff, and that is all about urban design. If there are opportunities to infiltrate water back down into the ground where it has traditionally gone, and then be gradually filtered through the ground to the riverbank into the river, that has much better outcomes for water quality than a direct flush off impervious surfaces, and sewage design as well. We need to make sure that our sewers are keeping up with demand for the water that's being generated. So maintaining capacity for increasing urban density in many places, and thereby reducing the wet weather overflows that occur. Designing sewers that have less stormwater going into them will be an important part of that. But if we can reduce the overflows and the leakages, then obviously we have beneficial impacts on public health, and we enable more waterways to be used more widely and under more circumstances. They're not so impacted for so long by a wet weather event.
Excellent. Now, sticking to the theme of sewage, we saw the value of sewage surveillance during earlier this decade during the COVID-19 epidemic. We've seen it for tracking other drugs, other pharmaceuticals, antibiotics, as your research has shown. Given that, what should the water sector be monitoring next?
There's lots of opportunity in epidemiological monitoring. I don't know if there's necessarily the water sector's responsibility. The water sector owns and manages the assets, so they have an important role to play. But we can learn a lot about patterns of disease in our communities, about outbreaks. In fact, perhaps it is useful for the water sector to be looking at things like cryptosporidium outbreaks, because they often are associated. It is often associated with swimming pools. So there are sort of recreational water users that would benefit from a more real-time understanding of what's going on with many diseases. There are lots of good examples, particularly internationally, looking at cholera and rarer viruses, polio and things that flare up occasionally from time to time, particularly in some less developed countries that don't necessarily have the same levels of medical surveillance. And so I think that's a key thing, that wastewater surveillance is complementary to medical surveillance. Doctors will identify when people have particular illnesses, and they'll often go off to a pathologist and find out what it is. That's an important way of collecting the data. There are some places that don't necessarily do that so well, and therefore you have this added importance of an alternative means. Um, Whether or not it will always provide a more rapid insight to what's going on than regular medical surveillance, I'm not totally sure, but we're certainly getting useful information around longer term trends of, as you said, things like drug use, certainly antibiotic resistance. We're really getting a handle on what's turning up in wastewater, and that should be helping to send a message for how we should change certain practices to better protect public health over the longer term.
Absolutely. Now, going back to the discussion around drinking water guidelines, because you've argued in the past that these guidelines are not just numbers on a page, but part of a proactive risk management framework. Can you tell me, what does good implementation of a proactive risk management framework look like? And equally, how can utilities avoid becoming reactive after a contamination story breaks?
Yeah, yeah. So that really is the story of the Australian Drinking Water Guidelines and WHO drinking water guidelines now. So in 2004, we had a revision of the drinking water guidelines. Prior to 2004, they pretty much were a list of standards at the tap, and so that's what we called safe drinking water. If you take a sample at the customer's tap, and if all the chemicals are below these numbers, then you have safe drinking water. But what that doesn't tell you is whether or not you have a potential accident that's just waiting to happen. You might be about to have a treatment malfunction because you're not maintaining a particular treatment process, or you might be just waiting for that big storm to come along that's going to wash all of these pathogens into the water and override the capabilities of the treatment process and expose people to harmful substances. If that's a scenario that's just waiting to happen, then I would argue you didn't have safe drinking water, regardless what you measured coming out of the tap yesterday. So that's the difference in philosophy. It's about understanding the risks. It's about looking at the catchment, looking at the treatment processes, thinking about what hazards might be present at unsafe levels, and what are you doing to prevent people from being exposed to those hazards at unsafe levels. So the barriers that you put in place, including the treatment processes. So then our attention turns to making sure that we understand the performance of those barriers and that we're monitoring those barriers, and we can identify when those barriers might be starting to underperform, and we can intervene long before you have the effect at the customer's tap. So that's what we mean about proactive risk assessment. You're identifying the risks and you're managing them before the incident occurs. There will always still be an important role for incident response. You know, things do go wrong. I'm not suggesting there won't be incidences, but they should be vastly reduced if we're doing effective proactive risk management. But we do still need to be monitoring what's happening in the community in terms of illnesses, and as best that we can, monitoring the quality of water that's being produced at the end of that treatment process. It's actually quite limited how effectively we can do that. You can't monitor every liter of water that comes through. We have quite, it is quite sporadic in terms of taking a sample that we hope to be representative and measuring contaminants that we hope to be representative. There are lots of limitations to retrospective monitoring compared to the more proactive approach, which can be a much more broad sweeping approach to managing contaminants. But they will both still be needed. But the emphasis, rightly so, certainly within the Australian drinking water sector now and in many other countries, is on proactive risk management, and that's where the guidelines direct us, and there's no turning back from that approach, I hope, and I'm fairly confident.
Absolutely. Now, in thinking about that, the water sector often talks about resilience, but resilience can mean many things with climate resilience, financial resilience, treatment resilience, cyber resilience, and community trust. Which form of resilience do you think is the most underdeveloped in Australia?
So I'm tempted to say climate because I'm very interested in climate resilience, and I think we have a lot of work to do in that space. But if you ask which is the most underdevelopment, I think I have to say financial resilience. I mean, there are many parts of Australia, particularly regional and rural Australia, where we don't have a sustainable financial arrangement in place for local government water utilities, some of the smaller water utilities in particular, to be able to fund the infrastructure, the maintenance, the operational requirements that are needed to confidently produce safe drinking water. And it is at a crisis level. You know, we have this very, if you look at New South Wales, this very retrospective approach to pretty much letting things fail. Governments, we deal with it. New South Wales government has grant programs to try and improve reliability of water supplies in some areas. To apply for that grant program, you need to show that you're in a pretty poor state and you're more desperate than the next person who wants that money. So it's a run to fail type scenario. We need a way that we can build up that financial resilience where water costs and safety do have costs associated with them. Providing safe drinking water does have a cost, but our ability to recover those costs from customers in particular is quite constrained. And I think that example is most stark for some of the smaller utilities in rural and regional areas, but it actually applies to our capital cities as well. You look at Sydney Water, you look at Tas Water, they put in their pricing proposals to build the infrastructure that they've identified needs to be built. And often the regulatory system that's in place around pricing, which would push those costs on to customer bills, pushes back on that, and they tend not to be successful in obtaining the money that's required. And I think we can see in New South Wales, we have another looming crisis around aging infrastructure. We're not updating, maintaining, replacing the infrastructure at a rate that is sustainable, because we can't afford to, because we don't have the funds to do that. So financial resilience leads to failures of every other type of resilience, really, because it's failure to invest where it's needed.
To finish off, in your opinion, what's the biggest opportunity in the water industry right now, and who's leading that charge?
I think the biggest opportunity is around understanding this quite renewed understanding around the need and the role for rainfall independent water supplies, and we see that in the Greater Sydney Water Strategy. Perhaps even, you know, that strategy is part of leading the charge, but we're seeing cities, all of the big cities now, um, recognizing that that's where drought security comes from, and it's where other types of water supply resilience come from as well during extreme weather events and things, is having multiple sources to be able to draw on. But drought resilience in particular comes from rainfall independent supplies. So actually thinking about how much of our water can we supply, and is there a benchmark there that really offers a sufficient level of drought resilience, and trying to build up to that benchmark is a real opportunity. So leaders in that space obviously include Perth, with Water Corporation having been the first mover for large-scale seawater desalination and built a very successful purified recycled water scheme for the groundwater replenishment scheme over there. But there are very active discussions going on everywhere else in every other major city about how do we build up rainfall independent supplies through those two main sources. And I think that is what we will see over the coming decades. That will be the big change. Will be reduced reliance on run of the river systems and big dams, and some greater reliance on some of these highly engineered but highly reliable sources of water.
Thank you very much, Professor Khan. And thank you for listening to Inside Water. If you found this conversation valuable, make sure you're following the podcast so you don't miss what's next. We'll be back soon with more insights from across the water industry, because the right upstream decision can help reduce those downstream challenges.